Welcome to the 2021 Anthony Joseph Drexel Biddle Jr. Lecture on International Studies, and welcome to our distinguished speaker, Ambassador Nicholas Burns. This endowed lecture was established by Mary Duke Biddle, Trent Semans, and James Semans and their family to honor Mrs. Semans' father, who had a distinguished career as US diplomat, and he was also an original signer of the Duke Endowment. The lecture series symbolizes Duke University's continuing commitment to promoting international understanding and public service. Before we start the program, Mary Duke Trent Jones will deliver a recorded video on behalf of her family. Thank you very much.
On behalf of my family, I'd like to welcome everyone to the first virtual Biddle Lecture. After the past year of quarantines and cancellations, it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to be together and honor my grandfather, Anthony Joseph Drexel Biddle Jr., Tony Biddle, in the midst of these changing landscapes of our world today. My mother, Mary Semans, took great pride in this lecture series because it paid tribute to this aspect of grandfather's life. As a young man, he was a bon vivant and an avid sportsman. And I'd like to interject here that I remember him well. He was a very good-looking but funny man who told jokes, and he was a great drawer. He would draw, when my mother was young, he drew caricatures and comic characters for her. So he was truly a bon vivant. But in midlife, this all changed, beginning with his service in World War I. He entered as an Army private and rose to the rank of captain. His path was forever altered. He realized what serving his country meant to him as it had to his father, and this began his life of service. In 1935, he was appointed as Minister of Norway by President Roosevelt, and then in 1937 as ambassador to Poland. Mother used to tell us that when Hitler's forces moved into Warsaw, grandfather left, taking many Poles with him, saving their lives. After this, in 1941, he became deputy ambassador to France, and after that, ambassador to the countries in exile, the Benelux countries, Belgium, Czechoslovakia, the Netherlands, Greece, Luxembourg, and Yugoslavia. Tony Biddle's picture was on the cover of Life magazine in October of 1943, and I brought a copy of that magazine along with me to show you the picture on Life. At that time, he was the ambassador to the governments in exile, which was headquartered in England. In 1951, Collier's magazine ran an article titled General Ike's Miracle Man. After you have read this, you will see that he was just a diplomat and a charmer. 1944, grandfather retired from the diplomatic corps and returned to Army life and rose to Brigadier General while working with General Eisenhower at SHAPE, the supreme headquarters of the Allied powers in Europe. His service continued as Adjutant General of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. This was followed by President Kennedy appointing him as ambassador to Spain. Sad to say that grandfather died of lung cancer in 1961, shortly after his appointment. Tony Biddle was a courageous man. He was a patriot and a diplomat. In these times, the need for diplomacy and understanding of all culture is critical. I feel my grandfather's service is especially relevant to the heeding call of those suffering from war and depression. He would be so honored that Ambassador Burns is our guest lecturer.
Thank you very much. And at this point, I will ask my colleague, Ambassador Patrick Duddy, Senior Advisor for Global Affairs at Duke University and Director of the Duke Center for Caribbean and Latin American Studies. And after Ambassador Duddy will introduce Ambassador Burns. Ambassador Burns will deliver his lecture. And after that, there is going to be time for a Q&A, which will be moderated by Ambassador Duddy. All questions, comments, and can be submitted throughout the lecture through the Q&A function. So please do use the Q&A function. So welcome, Ambassador Burns, and thank you very much for being here with us today. Ambassador Duddy.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor for me today to be able to introduce this year's Biddle Lecturer. And given the message we've just heard from the family, I can think of no more appropriate representative of recent decades in the State Department to deliver this year's lecture. Ambassador Burns was certainly one of the most consequential American diplomats of the last half century. He served as the U.S. ambassador to NATO, as the U.S. ambassador to Greece, as the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, as a spokesman, as part of the staff of the National Security Council. His career really was storied and extraordinary. But at least part of the reason that we have invited him this year to give the Biddle Lecture is because of the extraordinary work he has done since retiring from the department and assuming the position of the Roy and Barbara Goodman Family Professor of the Practice of Diplomacy and International Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School, where he and several of our other former colleagues from the State Department have undertaken a serious examination of the Department of State, its structure, and its capabilities. And I think he, and as well as others, have effectively advanced a conversation of real significance for the future. This afternoon, he will speak to us on just why it is right now that we should understand that it is a time for diplomacy. Without any further preamble, Ambassador Burns, it is a great pleasure for us to welcome you virtually to Duke University. Thank you for being with us.
Ambassador Duddy, thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. I wish I could be in North Carolina with all of you today. I understand it's a beautiful day. I'm up here in Boston with no leaves on the trees, but it's a great pleasure to give this year's Anthony J. Drexel Biddle Jr. Lecture at Duke, albeit virtually because of this seemingly endless pandemic in which we all find ourselves. It's a special honor for me to give the Biddle Lecture because he had a consequential career, as we've just heard from his granddaughter, as ambassador to Norway and to Poland, and as well as to Spain for President Kennedy. I'm very grateful to Ambassador Duddy. Patrick's a friend, a good friend from the United States Foreign Service, and I'm grateful that he asked me to give this lecture. I'm also very grateful to Professor Giovanni Zanalda for having also been behind the scenes in making this invitation. I want to salute another good friend and fellow member of the Aspen Strategy Group, and that's Duke Professor Peter Fever, who has one of the sharpest minds and sharpest wits of anyone I know in academic or public life. And as this is a day to honor diplomacy at Duke, I also want to recognize a third friend, and that's Steve Kelly, who's been at the Sanford School since his retirement from the State Department. Steve and I were sworn in together into the United States Foreign Service 39 short years ago in Washington, D.C. As career diplomats, Patrick, Steve, and I would like to think that we hail from a venerable and respected profession. The three of us are proud members of the United States Foreign Service. We each served as diplomats on behalf of presidents of both parties. But not everybody, it seemed, it seems, is so enamored of diplomats like us. Talleyrand, the great French statesman of pre- and post-revolutionary France, said famously, "Diplomacy is to lie and deny." David Lloyd George, British Prime Minister at the Versailles Conference in 1919, complained that diplomats, he said, were invented simply to waste time. Even President Kennedy was so frustrated by advice from diplomats that he characterized the entire State Department as a bowl of jelly. Notwithstanding these colorful criticisms of our profession, I come to Duke today to praise diplomacy for its past, but especially its future for the United States. And my principal message in this lecture is actually a prediction. By the next decade, if not before, we Americans will come to think of diplomacy as an indispensable asset as we confront the world, and we'll do that much more than we have in the recent past. In the current complex global landscape, where the United States can no longer get its way, in every case by force of arms, we're going to need to view diplomacy as a primary force to enhance our global power. All of us recognize how challenging a time this is for the United States and for all of us as Americans. President Biden is seeking to stabilize the very foundations of American power. He's trying to repair a fractured and crisis-ridden home front, trying to restore our economy, reinforce our technological and innovative strength, rebuild our global alliances in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific, and reclaim American leadership at the Paris climate talks, the World Health Organization, and at the United Nations in New York. As he and his very experienced team look out beyond our borders, they can surely rely on the world's most powerful and expeditionary military and on the world's most skillful intelligence network, both in the United States government. In fact, during the last 2 decades, our leaders leaned more heavily on our generals and admirals and intelligence chiefs than they did on our ambassadors in safeguarding the nation following the shock of 9/11, our entry into the Afghan war, the invasion of Iraq, the rise of deadly terrorist groups, the destabilization of the Arab world, the threat of nuclear power North Korea, and the threat of wannabe nuclear power Iran. As we look ahead to this decade and the decade beyond, we can no longer depend on the military and on our intelligence community alone. They'll be critically important, of course, in defending the country from foreign attack and from pernicious foreign influence. They'll be the first to admit, however, that they cannot face these challenges without a significantly strengthened United States diplomatic capacity. Our country needs a fully revived and rebuilt and restored State Department and Foreign Service if we're to meet the considerable challenges ahead of us. The reasons for this, I think, are clear for everybody to see. First, many of the most difficult and dangerous threats ahead will lend themselves at least as much to our diplomatic prowess as our military and intelligence power. To deal, for instance, with the potentially catastrophic impact of climate change, our diplomats will have to create and nurture a grand coalition of countries to do something about it, to meet the threat of future pandemics, and to learn the truth about the origins of the coronavirus itself is going to require a diplomatic purpose and diplomatic ingenuity. Most wars end with diplomats sparring at a negotiation table, and that is where we're going to need talented, experienced, and forceful diplomats to end the Afghan, Iraq, Syrian, and other conflicts from the world that 9/11 created. Future presidents of both parties will need a first-rate diplomatic corps to deal with threats from global crime and drug cartels, human trafficking organizations, and the advance of cyber criminals and the other nefarious forces that wish us ill. The second reason we'll need a stronger State Department and Foreign Service is to contend with perhaps the most difficult problem of all, China's ambitious bid for global power, Russia's determined assault on the independence and freedom of its neighbors. In other words, the rise in power and purpose and confidence of the authoritarian world and its aim to weaken our democratic world. We will need to expand US diplomatic power to compete successfully with these authoritarian countries. A changing global balance of power has narrowed the gap in power between the United States and its leading adversaries. And this is where diplomacy comes into play. America's diplomatic power combines the strength of our alliances and our leading coalitions, our economic and technological capacities, fueled by skillful diplomats like Patrick and Steve, wielding their unrivaled knowledge of negotiations, history, politics, and culture. It also includes, of course, diplomatic power from time to time, the weapons of intimidation and coercion, and if absolutely necessary, the powerful combination of diplomacy and the threat and even the use of force. This fusion of military, intelligence, and diplomatic power is how we won the Cold War, through containment. It's how President Clinton stopped 2 wars in Bosnia and Kosovo. It's how we incentivized Iran to seek the 2015 nuclear deal, given the fact that both the United States and Israel left the threat of force clearly on the table for the Iranians to see and reflect upon. Diplomacy also works best when far-sighted leaders take charge of a crisis and use diplomacy to point the way ahead. Think of FDR and Churchill's organization of that great global coalition to defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Think of Helmut Kohl, Mikhail Gorbachev, and George H.W. Bush's negotiations to unite Germany in the NATO alliance and to end the Cold War in 1989-90. Think of Nelson Mandela, who used a 4-year diplomatic negotiation to dismantle and ultimately to destroy the apartheid regime. Think of, in 2014, Angela Merkel, who led the world diplomatically in confronting and then sanctioning Russian President Vladimir Putin following his illegal annexation of Crimea. Diplomacy and negotiations, of course, do not always succeed. And at its worst, if diplomacy fails, then we get war and lawlessness and destruction. Vietnam and Rwanda and Iraq in the past, Syria, Tigray, Myanmar, and China's power grab in the South China Sea in the present. What has been missing in the US government in recent years is a strong, energetic, self-confident diplomatic corps. President Biden and Secretary of State Tony Blinken have shown that they truly appreciate the need to raise up diplomacy as a first-order priority for the United States. From their very first days in office, they've emphasized their determination to strengthen America's diplomatic power in the world. President Biden chose the State Department as the site of his first foreign policy speech. Some of his earliest and most notable appointments immediately strengthened our diplomatic bench behind Tony Blinken. Ambassadors Linda Thomas Greenfield, Wendy Sherman, Victoria Nuland, and Samantha Power, as well as an impressive and experienced team at the National Security Council, led by Jake Sullivan, John Feiner, Kurt Campbell, Laura Rosenberger, Simona Guha, and many, many others. For President Biden's new emphasis on diplomacy to succeed, however, it's the Career Foreign Service in particular that will have to be strengthened dramatically. It's no secret that the Foreign and Civil Service are at their lowest points in morale and effectiveness in the memory of anybody in this Zoom room. I began my diplomatic career 41 years ago as an intern at our embassy in Nouakchott, Mauritania, in the Sahara Desert. I've witnessed many highs and several lows of American diplomacy since. Frankly, I've been shocked to see the damage done to the Career Foreign Service during the last 4 years. The result is a disastrously low morale, a lack of budgetary support, the debilitating departure of some of our best and most senior ambassadors, the sidelining of the State Department by the previous administration, and the resulting lack of confidence in its future by the younger generation of diplomats who will be most critical to its resurrection. President Biden and Secretary Blinken have a rare opportunity to lead what has to be a radical overhaul of the State Department. Under their leadership, this has to be a first-order priority for the United States. Just after the presidential election in November, two close friends of mine, Ambassador Mark Grossman and Ambassador Marcy Reese, and I released a Harvard Kennedy School report that Patrick referred to, entitled A U.S. Diplomatic Service for the 21st Century. Our goal was to recommend fundamental steps necessary to reform the Foreign Service and to reposition it for success in the future. We had conversations with over 200 people inside the US government and outside in over 40 workshops during this past pandemic year, all on Zoom. And we reported in what we released that the Foreign Service is confronting one of the most profound crises in its long and proud history. We recommended a determined bipartisan effort to revive and restructure it. Specifically, we called for a new Foreign Service Act by Congress to set a renewed mission for the Foreign Service and give it a renewed mandate for a 21st century diplomatic corps. The last time Congress passed an act authorizing the mission of the Foreign Service was 41 years ago, when Patrick and I were starting out in the United States Foreign Service. We advocated in this report a relentless focus on far greater diversity to counteract the woeful lack of progress in the percentage of African Americans, women, Latinx Americans, and other minority groups in the senior ranks of American diplomacy. Given the proliferation of political appointee ambassadors at the State Department, we also recommended that by 2025, 90% of our ambassadors should be career appointees, not the 70%, as has been the custom in the United States for well past half a century. We also recommended that 75% of the powerful Assistant Secretary of State positions be held by career officers. During the Trump administration, not a single one of the 23 Assistant Secretary positions was led by a Senate-confirmed career diplomat. That had never happened before in the modern history of the United States Foreign Service over the last 100 years. Finally, we even proposed to rename the Foreign Service of the United States. We believe it should have a new name, the United States Diplomatic Service. This would signal transformation. It would signal a new role for our diplomats in this century, and this new title would begin with the two most important words, United States. So a reinforced career diplomatic corps would help President Biden and his successors from either party to revive American leadership in the world. President Biden's great insight, in my judgment, has been to see our alliances as our critical diplomatic instrument in the long-term battle that we have to sustain America's role in the world and to sustain the future of democracy in the world. The NATO alliance is fundamental to a long-term peace in Europe. It will be largely a diplomatic task to return the United States to leadership of NATO and to maintain allied unity to contain Russia's power in Eastern Europe. The challenge will be much more complex, I think, in the Indo-Pacific, where China is seeking to become the dominant military, economic, and technological power in that region and in the world. Chinese muscle flexing in the South and East China Seas has trampled on the sovereign and legal rights of 6 other claimant countries. Under Xi Jinping's leadership, Beijing is building a Navy, Air Force, and ballistic missile apparatus designed to contest American naval and air power and that of our allies in the Indo-Pacific. The Chinese have pushed aggressively against their neighbors during the past 12 months. Beijing has violated fundamentally its commitment to the people of Hong Kong. It has now suffocated their democratic and legal rights. Beijing continues to harass and intimidate Taiwan. It has picked a fight with India along their long border in the Himalayas. And the Chinese government's brutal subjugation of the Uyghur population of Xinjiang province is yet another human rights outrage that the world must address. In response, the United States must also use its diplomatic power to strengthen the Quad countries, as President Biden is trying to do. The United States, Japan, Australia, and India have to hold their ground, as democratic countries militarily and politically in that vast region. Together, these same four countries, again under President Biden's leadership, are now combining to offer vaccines to those in need in the developing world. And so our diplomats have to be on point for America in all these 21st century struggles and all the ones that I haven't mentioned. The job of establishing the many different coalitions necessary to counteract the authoritarian wave in the world today is going to sit squarely on the shoulders of the women and the men of the United States Foreign Service. And ultimately, our ability to act will also be a function for how we feel about ourselves as a nation. By this, I mean regaining the confidence necessary to act boldly and to dream big on the international stage. This is an important time in American history. I suppose that you at Duke, and I certainly am talking to a lot of our friends around the world. The question that I find is on the minds of many of our best friends around the world is whether America is declining as a global power, whether we have lost the capacity and will to do great things and to lead a great global coalition. I don't doubt our country. I think we will remain a great power. I don't doubt the will of the American people, but many people around the world are doing so now. And so if we fail to reform the State Department, if we fail to mobilize our alliances to prevail in the global debate in which we are now struggling between the merits of democracy versus authoritarianism, then we'll have failed to meet one of the most consequential tests of our time. If, on the other hand, we can succeed in reforming our diplomatic corps and lifting it up, and we can bind together the community of democratic nations and allies around the world, we can face the China challenge effectively in the next decade and the one after that. To accomplish all this, we're going to need to think as big and ambitiously as FDR, Truman, and Eisenhower did at another turning point in history after the Second World War. President Biden's vision of a conference of democracies is a big idea. Forming an American, UK, European Union, Japan coalition to offer a competitor to the Belt Road Initiative is another big idea. Establishing a coalition of the same countries to face down China on its unfair trade practices is a third big idea. Combining the scientific and entrepreneurial talent and power of the Indians, Americans, and Japanese to distribute vaccines globally is a fourth big idea. Big ideas help to make America the great power it is today when we had the self-confidence and vision to launch the Marshall Plan and the Interstate Highway System and the Gemini and Apollo space programs. Diplomacy in the service of big ideas is really quite critical for the future of American foreign policy. The ultimate big idea, of course, throughout human history, has been the search for a state of peace. And that is the work of diplomats too. When I was growing up outside of Boston in the 1960s and 70s, candidates from both parties, Republican and Democrat, for state or federal office would regularly hold up the banner of peace as the ultimate aim of the United States government. For many of these veterans of the Second World War, their campaign slogans boiled down to "Vote for me, I'll bring you peace." Since 9/11 and the two big land wars, most candidates in both parties today campaign by saying, vote for me, I'll bring you security. The goal of peace has largely disappeared from our national discussion. For those who might think that aspiring to peace might be naive or simply unachievable in the world today, consider the words of a combat veteran of the war in the Pacific, World War II, President John F. Kennedy, about peace. "Too many of us think it is impossible," he said in his landmark American University commencement speech in June of 1963. And he continued, "But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control." Kennedy's message in that speech was to affirm the ultimate responsibility of diplomacy, and that's to create a world worthy of our most hopeful ideals and even our most ambitious and seemingly out of reach dreams. Let me conclude on a final point. Diplomacy is most successful when it draws on the core strengths, the values, and the ambitions of the country that it serves. And that means that American diplomacy must be based both on our hardcore interests, of course, but also on our commitment to our American ideals of human and religious rights, of the rule of law, of civil liberties, and of democratic freedoms. This is what separates American diplomacy from that practiced by Russian and Chinese diplomats. A diplomacy that reflects American ideals helped to make America great during and after the Second World War. And it can help to make America the great and good power it needs to be again in our time. Thank you very, very much, Patrick, and all of you at Duke, for welcoming me today for this Biddle Lecture. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Nick. That was a marvelous address. And I know it has already generated quite a number of questions, but I'm going to perhaps abuse the privilege of serving as a facilitator to ask one or two things that are, to some degree, suggested by your remarks. The first has to do with the role of science and technology in diplomacy. You commented that the environmental challenges we face are extraordinary and among the most urgent matters before us. I and others, some here at Duke, note that basically the Department of State has done relatively little to assure that scientists or those with serious scientific training, technological backgrounds, are in the room when decisions are being made. Is there some way that you envision to make a much higher profile for science in the department, not just a nice to have, but a mandatory development going forward?
Patrick, that's a very good question, and I agree with the premise and with the thrust of your question. We've arrived at a time when you and I know that a modern diplomatic corps has to have a capacity in public health. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We've had 4 epidemics and pandemics in the last 17 years. There are pandemics ahead of us. And so the State Department has to, by bringing people in at mid-level, which we haven't really done very much before, but mid-career, I mean, people with experience who have expertise in public health, in artificial intelligence, in machine learning, in biotech, in quantum sciences, in climate sciences, because this is what's being discussed around the world. It's what's being negotiated in treaties at the United Nations and elsewhere. And while we do have some diplomats with this capacity, we don't have nearly enough. So one of the recommendations we made in our report, our Harvard report that we issued in November, was the State Department should not just take in officers at the junior officer level, 20-somethings the way we were, but obviously look into our society. Can we bring people in mid-career who might serve 5-10 years, but would give us for that time period the kind of expertise from these fields that we desperately need? We're also advocating, by the way, an ROTC program for the State Department so that people can train and serve maybe in an initial period, go back into public life, but then come back for a couple of weeks a year to do their foreign service duty. That could also supplement the ranks. And one of the other reasons, the last reason I like your question, is that I work in the Belfer Center for Science and Technology at Harvard Kennedy School. And we certainly believe that technology is going to be the dominant currency of power in the future. If you've read the books of Yuval Noah Harari, the great Israeli historian and philosopher king, and I have my students read 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, he thinks that biotechnology combined with artificial intelligence are going to change the way we think about power in the world. And he still thinks, obviously, that we're stuck with, the threat of nuclear weapons. We're stuck, obviously, with the threat of climate change. And so we just need to get people who are trained in these disciplines at the doctoral level to supplement the ranks of the rest of us who are more humanists and history majors, the way certainly I was as an undergrad. Thank you.
That's a great answer. And I hope that folks in the administration are listening. I'm going to ask one more very brief question before we go to the Q&A function. And that has to do with the challenge of disseminating our message to the rest of the world. The former Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, in a recent book noted, on the one hand, our current strategic communications were a mess. But he also said in another place in that book that we need to understand what happened with the absorption of USIA into the Department of State. That in effect, we diminished a key tool, the tool for conducting public diplomacy. And he actually makes the observation that with the dissolution of USIA, but the advent of the new communications technologies, which have flourished in the United States, we have in some respects more capability than ever, but less of an ability to mobilize and focus our communications capabilities on the problems in the contemporary world. Do you think that it would be possible in the coming years to significantly strengthen the public diplomacy role of the State Department?
I think we have to, Patrick. I was State Department spokesperson back in 1996.
I remember.
When we abolished USIA, essentially, the U.S. Information Agency, and we folded it into the State Department. And I think Secretary Albright and President Clinton and the Republicans and Democrats of Congress, I remember Senator Jesse Helms in favor of this, felt this was the right thing, the Cold War was over, et cetera. Well, we're now engaged in a massive battle of ideas. Xi Jinping told the assembled Congress in Beijing a couple of weeks ago, the National People's Congress, that authoritarianism is the way forward, not just for China, but for the world. He's saying that the East is rising. This is the Chinese bumper sticker. The East is rising and the West is diminishing. We don't believe that. So you have to have a concerted government-wide effort to project a message for what the United States stands for and what our values are, the values that President Kennedy was talking about in that speech a long time ago. And we don't have that agency right now. So it has to fall in the State Department. I hope this will be a major initiative of Secretary Blinken. He's doing such a great job. He has the weight of the world on his shoulders, but we've got to really take this seriously and we've got to focus on it. And whether or not we create a new agency or create the capacity within state to be more effective in communicating, I think that's the challenge. I will say, I've been very impressed by Secretary Blinken, by Ned Price, who's the spokesperson of the State Department. I'm on Twitter. That's my only social media platform that I'm really on. And, they're out every day on Twitter. Today is Holocaust Remembrance Day. They had a message for that. NATO, the 72nd anniversary of NATO was this past weekend, April 4th. Secretary Blinken had a message for that. They're out contesting China and Russia on the values front. And so we just have to consider this as a big job. It's just as important as, the kind of traditional diplomacy that you and I practiced in behind the scenes in closed rooms, without the press being present. Now you have to really be effective in explaining yourself. And the last thing I'd say, Patrick, is even with the best apparatus and the best will, you've got to have a message that's credible to the rest of the world.
Absolutely.
And, when we left the Paris Climate Change Agreement in 2017, and we're the second largest carbon emitter, how do you think the rest of the world took that? They thought it was pretty selfish for the United States. When we left the World Health Organization in the middle of a pandemic and said, we're taking our money and our power away, we're not going to help the rest of the world. We know how the rest of the world thought about that. So I think it was really important for President Biden on January 20th in the afternoon after he took the oath of office to say, we're back into the Paris Climate Change Agreement. We're back into the World Health Organization. America has to be part of the world. And unless we start right there, we're not going to have much of a message. For the rest of the world, I think President Biden, you've already seen in some of the early public opinion polls from various countries around the world, much higher degrees of confidence in the United States because we're pitching in. We're engaged. We're in the fight against the pandemic and against climate change.
Thanks. I'm going to, I may be summarizing some of the questions or compressing them a little bit, but we've gotten quite a number of questions from our audience. One that I think is really quite important, since you mentioned the issue of political ambassadors. But if I understood correctly, you have not suggested that we have none, but rather that we have a smaller percentage of our total diplomatic corps being drawn or sort of integrated based on political associations. How should we do that? Are you anticipating or recommending the adoption of metrics or some sort of objective criteria?
Well, it's a big issue, Patrick. You and I are both familiar with it. For those who are not, the United States is the only major country in the world that has a significant percentage of its ambassadors, not from career ranks, but political appointees from all walks of life. Since the Eisenhower administration, the rough ratio that every administration has held to, except for President Trump, has been about 70% of our ambassadors should be career diplomats like Patrick, and 30% should be political appointees. Ambassador Grossman, Ambassador Reese, and I, the authors of this report, we say 90% of our ambassadors should be career. These people are trained. They are the experts. They spend their entire lives working to become ambassadors. You wouldn't ask a political appointee to command a carrier battle group in the South China Sea. You wouldn't ask political appointees to run Ramstein Air Force Base for the United States Air Force Base. So why should we ask political appointees to run a lot of our major embassies around the world? That's our major point. It doesn't mean that we should go to 100% career ambassadors, because frankly, I think you and I would both say we've had some terrific political appointee ambassadors from both parties, presidents of both parties. You want to have, a president of a university or a CEO of a very, who's a good manager from an important American company, or a professor at Duke University who's an expert matter in that country. You want people like that to be eligible to be ambassador. So we say 90-10 to us is a better ratio than 70-30. At one point, President Trump had appointed the lowest percentage of career ambassadors in modern American history. So there's a crisis here. We know this can't happen overnight. Our goal would be, can you reach this by 2025, 4 years from now? And frankly, it puts a lot of pressure on the Foreign Service,
right,
to produce the women and men through training, through experience, who can rise to the occasion and be the kind of people that a president and Congress would want to see overseas representing the American people.
Yeah, I entirely agree with you. In brief, the Foreign Service, the State Department has to be ready to deliver the goods.
Right.
We have another question, which I think is an interesting one. You didn't really talk about diversity, but diversity is clearly an important consideration in American public life. And one of our questions, I'll actually read it to you. It's a terrific question. Beyond visible markers of diversity, to what extent is the State Department, do you think, prepared to welcome less visible signs of diversity, such as intellectual, cultural diversity, factors which are critical, arguably, to successful diplomacy and may be particularly relevant in dealing with the challenges represented by China and Russia?
Another great question. I did mention briefly in the speech the fact that one of our major recommendations in our Harvard report is much greater diversity. And let me just talk about diversity in two dimensions very quickly. Right now, the United States has, under the Trump administration, now we transition to a new administration, a very low percentage of our senior ambassadors and senior career officials are Latinx Americans, African Americans. Frankly, we're doing very well in women coming into the service, but we don't have enough women in senior positions yet. And there are all sorts of barriers. We're not to success for a lot of these minority groups. We're attracting a lot of young African American and Latinx American junior officers. We're not retaining them. A larger percentage of them leave in their first 10 years than white officers. Let me give you another data point. In the Obama and George W. Bush administrations, we had 46 African American ambassadors, Obama, 44 African Americans, George W. Bush, and 5 under President Trump. And so, frankly, there's a crisis of diversity. I testified with our colleagues, Ambassador Gina Abercrombie Winstanley and Ambassador Harry Thomas 2 weeks ago before the House Appropriations Subcommittee on the State Department, chaired by Congresswoman Barbara Lee, Chairwoman Lee. And she and other members of Congress are putting forward legislation to really encourage the State Department and the US government to do a much better job of diversity. It's so important that we look like America and all the various glorious groups that make us diverse as we represent ourselves to the rest of the world. But your questioner is right, that there are other types of diversity that we also have to be sensitive to. One, in particular, we struggle with this at universities, is we have to be ideologically diverse. I mean, we are nonpartisan inside the Foreign Service, and we serve both parties. But I would guess, Patrick, that the majority of our colleagues in the Foreign Service were probably center or center left. I'm not sure we had as many people from the conservative ranks. And I think for a healthy government, we have to be very much open and accommodating to people of all ideological stripes. And geographic diversity is very important. You know, Duke and Georgetown and Harvard and Stanford, because of the power of our graduate schools, really turn out a lot of the young people. They study with us who apply to the Foreign Service. And so one of our recommendations in our report is the Foreign Service needs to emulate the military. The military goes into high schools and recruits, as well as colleges, not just grad schools. And the military knows they have to go to historically Black colleges. And you have to go to community colleges to encourage young people to develop the skills and experience to then be eligible for the Foreign Service or the US military. And I don't think we do a good job of that. You know, I can tell you, I teach at Harvard, you teach at Duke. We have recruiters all the time coming to our university, and I'm glad they are, because we have a lot of young people who want to go in the Foreign Service. They should spend as much time at state universities as they do at some of the great private universities where we have the great fortune to teach.
Right. That's a terrific answer. Another very interesting question has come in. And as a preamble, I would note that early in my career, our career, I recall that there was something called a retired senior executive corps on which particularly the assistance agencies would call for help in the field. One of our viewers today has said, what about creating a pool of consultants? Not just on you've spoken very eloquently on setting up a reserve officer training corps, which I think is a great idea. But what about setting up some sort of pool of consultants to help with specific problems within the Foreign Service?
Boy, that's a very intriguing idea. And I'll just, there is the International Executive Service Corps.
Right.
And I discovered them in my second tour in the Foreign Service. I was in Jerusalem as a political officer for 2 years. My job was to run the American Economic Assistance Program for the Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So we were building roads and schools and health clinics, and we were trying to help Palestinian businesses to succeed. And guess who we recruited? The International Executive Service Corps. These were men and women who had had a full business career, who were retired, but who wanted to give back. And I had several of them come out. I can remember there was a crisis, there were a lot of vineyards for grapes table eating in the West Bank. And there was a blight on some of the crops in the southern West Bank near Hebron. We brought out a retired professor from UC Davis, who was an expert on phylloxera, I think was the name of it, the disease that was eating away at the vines. We had another executive who'd been in manufacturing come out, and he worked for several months with Palestinian manufacturing enterprises. And they were just worth their weight in gold. So it's a great idea. Diplomacy is not just people like you and me who are spending 20, 25, 30 years in it. It can be citizen diplomacy, and we can bring people out for 2 or 3 months or 2 or 3 weeks to do good things around the world. So I like that idea.
Another viewer has sent in a question, and again, I'm going to read it as I think it's intriguing. This viewer says, "This sounds like a silly question, but why should the president have a significant say over foreign policy?" I think the reader is suggesting that our national interest theoretically is largely the same from administration to administration. Why can't foreign policy and people who decide on what the foreign policy should be non-political?
Well, it's because the Constitution, of course, affords the president really very powerful authority over the nation's defense and foreign policy. And I think that the constitutional framers were wise to grant that power to the executive branch, because you want our president of either party to be able to react quickly in a crisis. And you want the president to have executive authority to act forcefully and effectively around the world. And sometimes Congress, the deliberations of Congress would make that very difficult. But I understand the question, and I guess there's a hopeful part of the answer too, which, Patrick, I think you'd probably agree with. It's interesting, you reflect on the partisan differences that we have. I mean, they're huge in this country. We are torn apart by differences on domestic policy. Look at the fight today on gun control, as the president announced quite modest measures, because he needs Congress to agree to the bigger measures to try to stem the deaths from gun violence. You don't see the degree of difference and the depth of passion in the differences between Republicans and Democrats in foreign and defense policy. Some of the issues I mentioned in the Biddle Lecture, Republicans and Democrats largely agree, almost completely agree on the value of NATO, on the value of our East Asian alliances, on the need to contain Russia. And I think there's almost absolute agreement in Washington these days among Republicans and Democrats on the need to compete with China, compete militarily, compete economically to protect American jobs and American intellectual property, compete in this battle of ideas that we've been talking about, democracy versus authoritarianism, compete technologically. I find with some solace that I think in foreign and defense policy, we're more relatively united across political lines than we are in domestic policy, So the president, of course, has the ultimate authority, but Congress has power of the purse. Congress has to confirm all ambassadors. Congress gets to pass laws that can regulate and govern how the United States behaves in the world. There's a current debate about the War Powers Act. There's another debate right now, should we do away with the authorization to use military force that Congress passed just after 9/11? And that's been used by several administrations to justify maintaining American troops around the world. Shouldn't we in 2021 have a new law that indicates what the United States can and can't do on that very big question of the use of force? So I do think you need Congress, you need citizens to be involved. But ultimately, you need a president with power enough to defend this country and to advance it.
Now, I'm going to give you another question that has just come in, and it will seem sort of basic, but I think it would be useful for many people. Someone wants to know, in a sense, what is it that an ambassador does most of the time? What is a day in the life of a U.S. ambassador like?
So I'm tempted to say, what do you think it's like? If you think it's people in striped suits at cocktail parties, that is part of diplomacy, but a very small part. Patrick and I can put together probably in 2 minutes a pretty good answer. Let me try first, Patrick, and then you tell me what I've missed. Ambassadors run embassies, and at our embassies now, we have nearly every U.S. government agency represented, from the Defense Department to the FBI, to the Department of Homeland Security, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, et cetera. And the ambassador is the president's personal representative to that country and to its government. And the ambassador runs the embassy, which is all those U.S. government services that we need. For instance, the ambassador runs the consular section. When you're an American citizen overseas and you get in trouble, as some Americans do, the consular section is there to help you. If you are overseas and one of your children is born, and my wife and I have 3 daughters, and our middle daughter, Elizabeth, was born in Jerusalem, your birth certificate is issued by the American consulate or embassy in that country. Consular services, number 1. Number 2, economic and commercial services. If you're an American company and you're bidding in a very competitive landscape against foreign firms, you want the help of your government to level the playing field with that foreign government that's going to make the decision on whether your company gets the sale or not. Economic and commercial diplomacy is a major part of an ambassador's life overseas. Third is what you might traditionally expect an ambassador to do: be the President and Secretary of State's person in representing our government to other governments. Sometimes, when I served at NATO or in Greece, with friendly governments. Sometimes, if you're in a place that's very difficult right now, I'm thinking of Patrick in Latin America, Venezuela. You might serve in a very difficult place where we have contentious relations, and your job is to defend the United States on issues big and small. And ultimately, ambassadors deal with war and peace issues. We try to stop wars. Sometimes we succeed, sometimes we fail. If there's an earthquake, like in Haiti, we try to mobilize the resources of the United States to help the people of Haiti and to help the American people caught up in that earthquake or tsunami or civil war. I remember, Patrick, I'll finish on this, in 2006, when I was Undersecretary of State, Condi Rice and I was working for Secretary Rice at the time, we worked 18 hours a day for 2 weeks during the Lebanon War, July 2006, evacuating 15,000 Americans. We, meaning the entire State Department, right? Not just the 2 of us, but evacuating 15,000 Americans from the war zone and trying to stop the war between Israel and Hezbollah. And it was a really difficult moment, but that's the ultimate thing that diplomats do. Patrick, I probably left something out that's important, but we're not just going to cocktail parties and, living the high life. A lot of our ambassadors are in harm's way. A lot of our younger diplomats served in Iraq and Afghanistan. They were seconded to military units, and they were in the field, not fighting, but being political advisors to our war fighters. So we do all sorts of things like that for the American people. Yeah,
that's a great answer, and I would supplement it only by noting that in addition to managing the whole platform of U.S. agencies and departments represented in any one country, an ambassador is uniquely positioned to act as a kind of political and cultural interpreter. There's no way that headlines are going to capture all of the reality of the political life of any given country, not ours and not any of the countries in which we've served. And I think that a big part of what we do in the field is to work to distill the most important elements of whatever it is that is going on, to communicate those back to Washington. And at the same time, I think we play a very important role in helping the most senior representatives of our host government understand how the US government works. Because our own government is big and complicated, and the reporting on American politics can be very confusing to a foreign audience. I'll leave it there, and I have another question for you where we have time for maybe just a couple more. Okay. One, and I'm going to try to recast this slightly so as not to compromise you too much. But one of our viewers asks, if you had to pick one country, one embassy or ambassadorial position as the most challenging and interesting out there right now for an American diplomat, what would it be?
Oh, goodness. And that's such a good question. It's a difficult one. It's really in the eye of the beholder. I mean, obviously, I think we need ambassadors in many places. We need ambassadors in Europe, Germany, France, Italy, Poland, to lift up the American leadership role in NATO, which was sadly neglected over the last 4 years. And President Biden's going to do that, but we need ambassadors to do that. Number one, we need ambassadors in places like Russia, China, Turkey, Hungary. These are 4 authoritarian governments, to stand up for democracy, right, and to stand up for what we believe as Americans and to compete with them. We need ambassadors in countries like India, Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, the rising Nigeria, the rising powers of the world, to connect with them. And as Patrick said, you do this in 1,000 different ways. It may be that Duke University has a program in a certain country that as an embassy, you want to help Duke because Duke's doing good work to connect the United States to that country. It may be that it's an NGO like Save the Children. One of the institutions we funded when I was in the West Bank was Save the Children because they were doing in Catholic relief services. So I think part of what we need around the world are ambassadors that help the United States, our private sector, our public sector, our nonprofit sector, our universities to integrate with the rest of the world. And I think those big rising countries, Brazil, South Africa, Nigeria, India, Indonesia, we need ambassadors who can solidify the American relationship with them. And, we went around the world. There are 195 nation states. We've got diplomatic relations with nearly everybody, not with Iran, not with North Korea, a few others. It's such an exciting job. It's such an important job for the American people.
Another viewer asks, how does the United States Diplomatic Corps reconcile sudden differences between administrations? This viewer notes the Trump administration withdrew from the Paris Accord, from the World Health Organization, et cetera. The Biden administration announced its intention to rejoin. But for many foreign publics, that about face, or the two, were quite shocking.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of how we have historically most successfully dealt with those sudden changes?
Well, it's a profound question. It's one that my students and I talk about a lot. I'm sure you do too, Patrick, you and Peter and others at Duke. And frankly, I've had a conversation with my oldest daughter about this when she was trying to figure out what she wanted to do in life. What we have to do as public servants is be nonpartisan. We take an oath to the Constitution, not to any party or president. And it's very important that the United States have as in the military, in the intelligence community, in the State Department, throughout the federal government, nonpartisan civil servants. That's what Patrick and I were. And that's what Steve Kelly was. You can't play politics. And that means you have to give every president your 100% dedication and loyalty. And you work as hard for one president that you may have voted for. You work as hard for the president you didn't vote for. Because if you don't have that, then the federal government's not going to work well. And one of the great glories of our system is we have a nonpartisan civil service.
Right.
I do think inside the government, beyond the glare of publicity and TV lights, we also have a responsibility to speak truth to power as Foreign Service officers. And the hardest thing to do, and Patrick and I both had to do it, is to go in to see the president or secretary of state or the ambassador if you're working for him or her and say, Madam Ambassador, Mr. Ambassador, I know you want to do A, but I would very respectfully argue you need to do B. And here's the deal when you go into the federal government. If you win the fight or the argument, good, your viewpoint has prevailed and you've had an impact on policy. If you lose the argument, then you've got to go out and support the argument that that your boss wants, the argument that you lost too. And that is also the nature of public service. And I think you have to have that spirit. We'll work just as hard for President Trump as we work for President Obama or President Biden or President George W. Bush, because the government won't work if we play politics inside the U.S. government.
I have one final question for you, Nick, and I think you've given some tremendous answers. Someone writes that he was essentially pushed out, he felt, and that indeed many have been pushed out. And this one viewer notes that in fact, in the last 20 years, not just in the last 4 years, those who might have been characterized as to some degree peacemakers, or those who are advocating for non-military responses to some of the crises we faced, found themselves marginalized. Do you think it will be possible in the future to reintegrate some of those as the new administration embraces diplomacy in a new and different way?
I hope so. We've had as you know, Patrick, we've had so many people leave, not just especially over the last 4 years, but not just over the last 4 years. There's been a crisis of confidence in the State Department. And part of the battle is for the State Department to lift itself up. I mean, we are not just victims in the Foreign Service.
Right.
Part of our culture needs to change. We need to be less risk averse. We need to be more intellectually minded and strategically minded, frankly, in our devotion to the profession. And yet part of the problem is the fact that the State Department hasn't been as valued. And I said it in my Biddle Lecture, as have the military and the intelligence community. And I think that mindset needs to change in both political parties. I have said, and I'll say it again, I think President Biden truly respects the Foreign Service. He understands us. I remember, Patrick, when I was ambassador to NATO, Senator Biden came out at a very difficult time. We were I think had just gone into Iraq, as I remember it. And, stormy seas in Europe, a lot of the allies opposed us. And he really helped me when he came out and stayed for a couple of days and talked to my counterparts and addressed NATO and tried to explain what we were doing. I think we have a president who will lift up the Foreign Service. And I think we ought to have a big tent mentality for those people who, if they feel they've been forced out unfairly, and I'm sorry if that's what happened to the questioner, I hope that there'll be a spirit that will want to take back some of the people who felt that they were no longer welcome. Because after all, as I said, and we've just discussed, Patrick, the ultimate job of a diplomat is to be dedicated to peace and to the nonviolent resolution of disputes. That's who we are. And therefore, that has to be the primary mission of the American Foreign Service.
Ambassador Nicholas Burns, my old friend and much admired colleague, thank you ever so much for your remarks and for the patience with which you have handled these many questions. I think both your career and this dialogue you have begun with the public on the importance of diplomacy and of the State Department serve the nation exceptionally well. And I don't doubt will inspire some of our younger viewers today to consider once again public service and very, very possibly diplomatic service. With that, thank you so much. And I hope to see you on the ground in Durham, enjoying some of this great weather the next time we get together.
I hope so too, Ambassador Duddy. And let me just thank you and thank the Biddle Drexel family and thank everybody at Duke for listening today. And if you are one of those students at Duke who might be interested in public service, go see Patrick Duddy, go see Professor Peter Feaver, go see Steve Kelly, go see Ambassador Bob Pearson, and they'll tell you how you can succeed. So Patrick, thank you.
And thank you very much. Good night, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us.